Hi everyone. Well, we're in the last module. And for this module, you'll be reading a couple of chapters from a book that a colleague of mine and I put together. And I thought it was appropriate to do so because I don't like to kind of, force my book on other people. But I think it speaks to where we are in this course now. And that is, we've talked about the past, we've talked about we are living in the present. Now, what does this mean for the future and for our own actions in our school? So I wanted to consider that in this module, and I wanted to, in this video, just kind of provide a little bit of a historical timeline to think about why we are where we are, and what we can learn from that. Because I find so many people don't really understand or have never learned about, would be a better way to put it, their own history as advocates for change in education, because it's a very exciting history, actually. So I want to just give us a little look at that today, and the two chapters that you'll be looking at give you a look across a particular domain. So throughout this course, we've considered practices in schools and school systems, as you know, around gender. For some, this has been an eye-opening experience. At least that's what I hear every time I teach this course. I didn't know this before, or I've never taken a course like this before. And for others, this is just Monday. This is just the way things are, and this is how you understand the world. In other words, we all come to this course and leave it with a varying degree of understanding, concern, and commitment for change. And that's absolutely fine. In this last module, however, I'd like us all to consider where issues around gender have been, where they are currently, and where we see them going next. A colleague of mine at the University of Saskatchewan and I, Don Moline that is, and I became friends when I was the new president of the Canadian Association for the Study of Women and Girls in Education. It was the 10th anniversary of CASWay, which is what we call this organization for short. And we were going to be celebrating the event at the location for our conference that year, the University of Manitoba. And Dawn was the professor there at the time and was volunteered to take on the on-site role for organizing this event by her dean. So we met at a conference prior to this conference and had a chance to talk about what this might look like. It was one of the things we wanted to celebrate was the fact that this was the 10th year of CASWay, and there have been a lot of really good work that had been done over those years. So we wanted to celebrate that. And that celebration was a spectacular event with women scholars, many of whom have been founding members of CASWay, who came from all over Canada and the United States, and in some cases other parts of the world. We celebrated where we had been and what had been achieved, but there were also very lively discussions about where we were going. In other words, there were arguments about where we might be going, which is, par for the course. Some were quite content to have a safe place within the much larger CSSE Education Conference, which is what CASWay was a part of each year, to present our scholarship and get together for dinner and that kind of thing. But I remember others who argued vehemently for greater engagement with emerging social issues around the environment, justice for Indigenous peoples and the LGBTQTS plus community, and other marginalized voices. It was the beginning of a move toward a more intersectional approach to our scholarship, although most of us couldn't have named it at the time, because this would have been, gosh, I should have thought of this before, but this would have been probably about 1997, maybe 1996, somewhere around there. I should look that up. If I come across that information, I'll post it. Anyway, a few years passed, and Dawn and I were having coffee together following several sessions at CSSE, and noted that some voices were absent. Many of the founding members of CASWay were retiring, and those historic voices were going to soon be lost to all of us. At the same time, we observed the emergence of fresh voices in the field for whom feminism had always been intersectional, and that's when the idea for this book was born. What we wanted to do was pull together scholarship across the continuum of scholarship, from those who had been early feminist scholars to those who were emerging feminist scholars. And the result is transforming conversations. Feminism and Education in Canada since 1970. But why 1970? Well, that's when the document containing the report of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in Canada was published. In 1967, as a response to a growing women's movement in Canada and a very active lobby among women educators and other activists, Lester Pearson, who was Canada's Prime Minister at the time, struck the Royal Commission. Thousands, literally, well, you can see some of them in that pile in front of the leader of the commission were, they came in droves from all over Canada, and then including the northern part of Canada. They made recommendations from all social sectors. Sorry, I missed something here. Committee meetings were held and a document was finally tabled in 1970. So you remember that it was started in 1967. So they took a full 3 years to pull this together that made 167 recommendations across all social sectors, but focused specific and careful attention on education. This was a key historical moment for a coalition of feminist activists led by Laura Savia and supported by Judy LaMarche, who was the only woman in cabinet at the time. They had all advocated strongly for such a commission and were joined by many women who may not have called themselves feminists, but knew that they were not being treated fairly and felt that something needed to be done. Florence Bird was named chair and the work began. And as I said, they received thousands of these briefs from advocates all over Canada who had various concerns, particularly around education. The Commission report made 167 recommendations overall, many of which were in education, but also childbirth policy, birth control, family law, alimony, and other areas, all of which had a direct or indirect effect on children's and women's lives. The Commission report set in motion a great deal of activity among teacher organizations and even some parent organizations in the 1970s to counter some of the ways in which education acted as a reinforcer of gender norms, and they called for change. So we called the section in the book that's dealing with this time period and the kinds of things that were going on during this time, Speaking Up, because people that had been silenced or had been unaware began to understand and began to speak up around these kinds of issues. So what are some of the issues addressed by RCSW and feminist theorizing and activism in education? Well, one of the areas that came up was sexual stereotyping in school resources. Now, I'm old. I'm old enough to remember teaching the Dick and Jane series when I was teaching in grade 1. I think it was right at the very end, and I don't think they were called Dick and Jane anymore. I think they were called Ted and Sally or something, I can't remember, but it was that same series, and it was so full of gender stereotypes. It was just unbelievable. You know, the little boy dressed up like his dad and went off to work because that's what dads did, and the little girl dressed up like her mom and took care of doll babies, and that's what, you know, she had seen, and that's what women did and were expected to do. So, you know, that kind of male box and female box was on overdrive during this time. And we saw this reflected in school resources. So the recommendation was that this be looked at, because if we were going to be trying to open up opportunities for boys and girls that were broader than you know, those boxes would designate, then we needed to see other kinds of models. And so this was one of the things that was taken on. Teaching practices that reinforce stereotypes for girls and boys. And we, you know, most of us don't do these kinds of things anymore in classrooms, or you don't see it. You know, boys line up here, girls line up here. Boys pick up the tables, girls go and get the tea, you know, those sorts of things. And so we've really gone a long way past these kinds of things, but these were very, very heavily practiced in schools all over Canada all the time. And for years, even after the RCSW was published, they began to change, but it took a long time for a lot of those things to change in schools. The gender distribution of work in schools, who did what? So who were the janitors and who were the lunch people? Who were the teachers and who were the leaders in schools, and who were the superintendents of school systems and that sort of thing. So there were questions asked about that. Education policies that reinforce stereotypical gender roles that do not account for the broader definitions and understandings of gender and intersections with race, culture, indigeneity, disability, minority, gender, identity, class, etc. Now, none of this was in the report. This is what has emerged later. But by asking these kinds of questions, these kinds of things began to emerge as well. Once you start down this road asking these kinds of questions, it's hard to avoid a lot of the questions that start to emerge around them. All of this activity around equity began to stir interest in a formal policy expression of the rights and freedoms of Canadians, and in 1982, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was signed into law. This was an important step in Canada's movement to provide a policy environment that would mediate the conflicting interests of an increasingly diverse population. While gender was one of the protected rights, other rights were not spelled out under the Charter. One case that began in Alberta was Vriend versus Alberta. Dylan Vriend was the lab coordinator at King's College, and he was fired based on his sexual orientation. When he brought his grievance to Alberta Human Rights Commission, he lost his case because sexual orientation was not a protected right under the Charter. Based on the absence of this, or based on this exclusion, when other rights are protected, his case went to the Supreme Court, and he won that case. Sexual orientation is now a protected right under the Individual Rights and Protections Act and is understood to have the same strength as other charter rights. Now, that's a little complex, and what I mean by that is LEAF, which is a feminist legal group. They came into this case, and because he was fighting for his rights as a homosexual, they were afraid that other rights, like rights of lesbians, may not be included. So they fought for the designation of sexual orientation to broaden the scope. However, because the charter couldn't be changed at that point, because it was in law, and it would have required another huge kind of policy process to be able to change it. This was the way they got around that. So it's actually in another piece of law, but it has the strength of charter. The 80s proved that actually proved to be a bit of a surprise to me. I didn't know that part of that particular case, but it's kind of interesting to see how that worked. So the 80s proved to be a time of great activism and growth in gender equity in schools and school curriculum and around issues of gender identity too. More women were becoming school leaders and salaries were becoming more equal in many workplaces. It was far from ideal, for sure, but there was excitement in the air, including equal employment protections in many provinces. People were learning to speak up, to have their voices heard around issues of equity, and changes were being made. And in some of the papers, some of the authors talk about the excitement that there was as people really saw their actions turning into change for the better, what they saw as the betterment of educational opportunities for students. Then the 90s began. That is the 1990s. And in many ways, women were doing better. Jobs were opening up. And here's a clip from an old article. I'm even warned on social media that it's an old article from the Globe and Mail. And it's from early 2000, but it's actually speaking about the 1990s previous. So it speaks to women doing better. Jobs are opening up and a higher percentage of women were seeking employment and were finding work. However, this raised greater concern around equal pay for equal work, fairness in promotions, and an awareness of the many ways that women felt silenced in the workplace. In the meantime, there was a contraction in the economy in the 90s, and people were frightened about losing their jobs and having to pay more for housing and food. Does this sound familiar to anyone? In several provinces in Canada, much more conservative governments were elected, and equity initiatives were almost immediately squashed. In Ontario, completely. I was researching equity employment policies in 4 boards in Ontario at the time for my PhD. And while I was researching, the policy completely changed from a very open policy to a completely closed policy in 1995. Almost all initiatives were shut down, progressive education initiatives were cut, and a return to highly mediated curriculum that was surveilled with high-stakes standardized tests was implemented. And through all of this, women continued to speak out as they had finally learned to do in the 1980s, but their voices were heavily muted, and it was so much worse for racialized women who were often last hired and first fired. The 2000s have continued to be a time of contrasts. As immigration in Canada has increased and critiques of the effects of colonialism are made ever more strongly by Indigenous and immigrant groups, while members of the Black community advocate strongly for equal rights to safety and fairness under the law in employment and in school practices, and as disabled and LGBTQTS+ advocates assert their rights, we also see increasing contraction of those rights under populist right-wing governments. However, these governments are finding it difficult to put the equity genie back in the bottle. These then are difficult, challenging, fiery times that offer real opportunities for change, but also lots of opportunities for lack of exchange between people who have different ideas. Advocates who understand what is at stake have learned to speak back, and Tashika's reading in Module 4 comes from a section of the book that is from authors speaking back against colonialism and sexism and racism, but offering an alternative that is more inclusive. And I think this is important reading. So if you have a chance sometime, I would suggest you read some of the chapters in that section because they're really very interesting and really, I think, positively provocative. So what does this mean for us? Well, that part of the story is unwritten, and you will be the storytellers. I hope that what you have learned in this course from each other and the readings will be something that you can bring into your school that will encourage change, policies, and practices that promote inclusion rather than exclusion. That's now up to you, and I can't wait to hear your stories. So if you have some to share with me, always be in touch. I'll have my UAlberta email for the rest of my life. So if you ever want to share with me some things that are going on in your school that you've been a part of or that you observe that are encouraging, I'd love to hear them. So we come to the end of I've come to the end of my videos. We haven't quite come to the end of the course. But certainly if you have any questions or concerns or things you'd like to talk about now that we've come to the end of our course and there are issues that have been raised for you, I'm always open to that conversation. It's been wonderful to be a part of this course, and I welcome any opportunity for us to have an opportunity to continue the conversation at some point. So take care.